Good morning. So we're here for the second session of our summer prevention webinar series today. Thanks everybody for joining. I'm Megan. I'm the systems coordinator for WCASA. And just as a quick reminder, like I said, this is the second session of this series. The topic today is zooming in poetry as an entry point into violence prevention work. And we are so lucky to have Kyle, also known as the spoken word artist Guante, presenting today about the work that he does with youth. And then next week we'll have Amy Hasanoff from the University of Colorado presenting about how to talk to teens about sexting. And then the week after that, we're going to have Laura Zarate from from Artesana presenting about the impact of external and internalized misogyny on Latina survivors. And then this is just a quick reminder about the great resources we have on the WCASA prevention page. The Consent Is Toolkit was released last year, and it was a collaboration with a few different agencies. And then over on the right, this is an image from our Social Norms Toolkit. And this is really the framework that we'd use for a lot of our prevention work. And then just a reminder about WCASA Prevention TA. You can reach out to Kelly, Jesse, or myself if you have any technical assistance needs around prevention or evaluation. And then just some quick housekeeping. The chat and question box is there for you. We highly recommend that you use dial-in audio. It works a little better, especially in those more remote areas. And let us know using the chat box if you have any problems. Peter is standing by to help you with technology issues. All right. And then with that, Peter, is there anything else you want to add about housekeeping?
We'll be taking questions as we go, so feel free to put them in there, and then we'll find a good time to have Kyle take them as we go.
All right, great. Wonderful. Now we'll turn things over to Kyle.
Okay. Cool. Yeah, this is definitely different than what I'm used to. I think for a lot of us who do like facilitation or trainings, like it's very much about like dialogue and writing stuff on the board and having people add to it and activities and stuff. So this is a little different. I think definitely feel free to use that chat box. You know, if there are moments where the other organizers want to interrupt me and say we have a question, that works. There are also some natural kind of transition points built in. So yeah, whatever makes sense. I'm super flexible here. But yeah, I'm gonna leave my screen up too, just in case that can be useful for accessibility's sake or whatever. It's fine if I'm the only person that's up there. Like I don't mind. But yeah, does that sound cool? I'm asking. I'm gonna assume that's cool.
It's cool.
Yeah. So yeah, my name is Kyle Tran Myrhe. My stage name is Guante. I guess this is in terms of basic kind of foundational stuff, introductions. You know, he, him, his pronouns. I'm a poet. Been doing spoken word stuff for the past 10, 12 years now, pretty much. I'm a two-time national poetry slam champion. I've performed at the United Nations, you know, all over the place. And which is all just to say that like this has been a big part of the work that I do for the last like decade of my life. But it's also in the context of my background is in social justice ed, like social justice education and facilitation. So you know, facilitating dialogue around white supremacy and gender violence and all of that kind of stuff. And so today, the primary work that I do is kind of like finding the synergy between those two different backgrounds. You know, for example, a lot of times I'll go to colleges, they'll bring me in to, you know, ostensibly do a poetry performance, but then that poetry performance is often co-sponsored by like you know, gender, women's sexuality center or a multicultural center or something like that, to be a space where we can talk about the art side of things, but we can also have a deeper conversation. I just finished grad school, and my grad school research was all about how spoken word specifically, but I also think art more generally can be used to make social justice education spaces more critical. So it's not just a PowerPoint presentation about how to sound less racist, but it's actually hopefully a deeper dialogue around power and around agency and around specific things that we can do in the spaces we have access to change things. I think poetry can be a really useful entry point into that, which we'll get to in a little bit. Yeah, I'm often, I guess more specifically, often brought into spaces, colleges and conferences to talk about kind of healthy masculinity stuff and gender violence prevention stuff. And I also work here in Minneapolis as part of an organization called True Art Speaks, which does direct kind of youth development, youth leadership work through arts and, hip hop pedagogy, stuff like that. And yeah, like I said, my approach to this is very much informed by critical education, like critical pedagogy stuff. So I don't generally lecture a lot. Like, I would be asking questions and stuff if we were in person, just because of the nature of the platform. We may do that a little bit less than usual. But again, if at any point, because of what I do is fairly niche, if that's the pronunciation that we prefer right now, niche, it may not be relevant in every space to the same extent all the time, but I feel like there are certain things I want to share just as tools that you can pull out what might be useful for the population that you work with and the spaces that you work with, and then leave whatever isn't relevant. That's perfectly fine too. But yeah, I guess to kind of frame everything, and we'll stop in a second to see if there are any thoughts. But I'm thinking about two things. One is I think spoken word specifically as a tool to do violence prevention work, and we'll talk about like what spoken word is and all that. But then there's also, I think, a larger idea of what an arts based or like an arts oriented approach to this work looks like, particularly in the context of working with youth and kind of outreach culture shifting work. And I'm also under the assumption that we're not just talking about like educating people about gender violence prevention, but activating them. We're talking about like creating space for young people to become activists and advocates and not just learning about the issues. That's kind of how I frame this, at least. And so I'll start with kind of a big idea that guides a lot of my work. We don't have to spend a ton of time on that, but because I really want to get into application. So when I share this big idea, what are 4 or 5 different ways that it might apply to the people who are doing this frontline work every day? I'm really interested in application. And so yeah, just in terms of an outline, I was going to talk a little bit about what spoken word is for people who aren't as familiar with it. Talk about that big idea of this idea of translation, how we take ideas and translate them into images in poetry, and how that also relates to activism, how we take ideas and translate them into action, right? And then that application piece. And so, yeah, this is a natural break before I get into just what is spoken word. If there are any thoughts, questions, guiding questions that people might have, you can feel free to put that in the chat box. But otherwise, I'll just keep moving. Cool. The signal could totally die and I would just keep going and no one would have any idea. Like, I'm just talking to myself.
No, right now we don't have any in the chat, in the questions box.
Okay, cool. So yeah, jumping into just like a very basic, introduction to what spoken word is. I think there are a lot of misconceptions about it. Like when I go around the country and I tell people that I'm a spoken word poet or a slam poet, like I know that the first thing that 90% of people think is that one scene in the movie 22 Jump Street where what's his name is doing like really, really cliche bad spoken word. And yeah, I think it's a really easy form to like parody, right? Because it's super earnest and like sincere, and it's like young people like telling their stories, and like that's easy to make fun of. But I think if we back up a little bit and talk about like why that is, that might be useful. So just basically on a basic form level, I think the spoken word as poetry that is performed out loud, right? Like it's you don't have to be super deep with it. There are other definitions where people would say that it's poetry that is written with the intent to be performed out loud. So like that informs your approach to writing. For any of you who have like creative writing backgrounds or poetry backgrounds, it is a little bit different in that it's shared with people on a stage, and so people only have one chance to hear what you're saying, and so it does inform your approach a little bit. But I also think about spoken word a lot as very much kind of like a hybrid form, in that it draws from different places, right? So like it is poetry, but it's also theater, and that there's a lot of kind of acting tactics and like theater tactics that are used. A lot of like what's it called? Method acting that's used for poets. It's also stand-up comedy, right? And that like it's just you and the audience and a microphone. There's no props or costumes, and that can be that's a space of vulnerability. It's also rhetoric, like how you give a good speech. Like a lot of that goes into spoken word. It's also music, it's jazz, it's hip hop, it's like it's storytelling at the end of the day. Like if we had more time, we could do a whole long history lesson about this current kind of spoken word boom that people think of when you say the word slam poetry or spoken word. People generally think of like the last 20 years of like Def Poetry Jam and button poetry and like poetry slams in communities. But obviously like spoken word is one of the oldest art forms that human beings have, right? Like the idea of people telling stories and passing down information about the group or the community from generation to generation, like that's part of the oral tradition that almost every culture on earth has some form of. We can trace this current manifestation of spoken word back through the Black arts movement in the 70s, through like the beat generation in like the 50s, through the Harlem Renaissance, going back all the way to like, the griot, like the West African tradition of, again, telling stories, sharing information through the oral tradition. And so I think, we don't have time to really, really get into that in a deep way, but I do think it's worth having that kind of in the background of this larger conversation about when people do participate in spoken word spaces. They're taking part in a much older tradition than we generally often even know. But yeah, like I said, we don't have a ton of time to get into that. I think the stuff that might be relevant to what we're actually talking about today are kind of the not so much the formal elements of spoken word, and which just to say there aren't a lot of formal elements. Like spoken word poem can be really whatever you want it to be. It can rhyme, it can not rhyme, it can be like big and loud, it can be really quiet and just your basic everyday voice. Like there's a ton of flexibility with the form. There aren't rules to it in the same way that there are rules to like writing a haiku, if you remember from high school, right? Or a sonnet. And like that can be very intimidating, but it can also be super liberating once you kind of wrap your head around the freedom there. But so again, what might be relevant to today's conversations, I think apart from the formal stuff, spoken word is about a space to tell your story, and I think telling your story is something that we can talk about in a little bit too, and kind of the pros and cons of being super, super literal with that. Because we know in prevention work, particularly around rape culture and gender violence, like there's already kind of a whole culture around telling your story, like take back the night, that kind of thing. And I think that spoken word spaces is a space for that, but it's also a space for, I think, expanding the definitions of what telling your story means. And being able to do it in different ways, to take really specific approaches to that story, to reach out to people in different ways. But yeah, so it's a space to tell your story. It's about the idea that everyone has a story, no matter where you come from. Everyone can have something to add to this larger cultural conversation. I think spoken word, just as a national kind of literary and artistic movement, is driven by young people. People come to spoken word from every different demographic group and age level and all over. Like it's a very authentically, at least in my experience, going to national, competitions and the national youth competitions and stuff, like it's a very authentically diverse space. But I would say that it's very much driven by young people. And I think especially young people of color, and especially LGBTQ youth, and all the intersections of those different groups. I think that's really the kind of driving force behind why the culture is becoming such a big deal right now, as opposed to, Def Poetry Jam happened 15 years ago or whatever, and was a show on HBO that lots of people watch. But I think what's happening right now feels different in that, aside from physical events like Brave New Voices, which just happened in Houston last week, and then other kind of big national event style things, there's also the rise of like viral videos, right? Button Poetry is an organization in Minneapolis where they just travel around the country to different poetry events and they film them, and every day they post one new video. And so since some of those have been really catching fire and going viral, it's created this whole kind of upswell, that's not really a word, but yeah, whatever, in people's interest in poetry, and again, especially young people. And so that kind of is a background to a lot of the work that I do, is like, how do you take that interest and that kind of the power that comes from that basic format And how does that relate to prevention work? How does that relate to social justice education work more generally too? And that's kind of what we'll be talking about today, if that works.
If cut in real quick, one person actually just piggybacking on what you said spoken word is like poetry that tells a specific story that brings light to a social justice issue in that person's understanding.
Yeah, I think I tend to be a little, what's the word? I think a lot about definitions with spoken word, because I think, again, there are a lot of weird kind of stereotypes out there about what spoken word is, and that it's like a kid with like a beret, like playing the bongo drums, talking about like the man or whatever. And those stereotypes are pretty deeply rooted. I think I agree with what that person said, but I also think that is maybe incomplete, and that I think a lot of spoken word is about storytelling, and a lot of it is about social issues and social justice issues, but it doesn't have to be. And I think that's one thing that's really powerful about the community and the forum, is that it's endlessly dynamic and endlessly diverse, and that you can get up on a stage at an open mic or a poetry slam and do whatever you need to do in that space, like for your own health or for your own enjoyment, so you can totally write poems that aren't about anything. That's part of the culture too. But I do think that the point about it being a space to talk about, quote unquote, real issues and to tell our stories is the reason that takes up so much of the space within spoken word as a larger movement and community, is because we don't have a lot of opportunities to do that in other spaces, right? To stand up on a stage and talk about your experience and be validated for it and have people clap and, meet other people who've gone through that same thing. So yeah, it does tend to be more like that. I would say that it doesn't have to be. But yeah. And that's actually, again, we don't have a ton of time to get into the background stuff, but one thing that I wrote specifically for this conversation, it's the first chapter of my book, but it's also available online in its entirety. Can you switch the control panel over to me?
Yep, just 1 second.
But just as a background resource, in case people are interested in it, you don't necessarily have to buy my book, because this chapter was really important to me, so I put it online. But yeah, it's just called it 10 Things Everyone Should Know About Spoken Word and Slam Poetry. And it covers a lot of some of this definitional stuff about like terminology, this whole argument about whether it is poetry or not, like whatever. Some of the demographic stuff, some of like, yeah. I mean, I won't go through the whole thing, but if you are interested, I can share that link. Yeah, I don't know if it's easier just to straight up share it in the chat box, or I can give you a list that you can email out to people at the end.
Yeah, either way. We can put it in the chat box.
I just threw it in. I don't know if other people see that, or I just see that, but yeah, that's in there. Okay, so I'll stop that. But yeah, so I was gonna keep moving unless with any other hands up.
Yeah, there was something.
Yes, there's a comment.
So, it says, this person, I endorse the comment that the spoken word scene is the most diverse scene in the U.S. and works to break some of the stereotypes we see. Culture generally tremendously fun too, from a 65-year-old fan.
That's great. Yeah, and I mean, I guess that does make me think of one thing that might be worth talking about before we keep going, is just basic terminology stuff, right? So like spoken word is what I said, it's people writing poems and saying them out loud, like whatever. But when people say slam poetry, they're often used interchangeably, but they don't necessarily mean the exact same thing. Like slam poetry to me is spoken word that is performed at a poetry slam, which is a specific kind of style of event. It's a competition in which whether individuals or teams like share their original poetry that they wrote, they perform it out loud, and then judges give them scores. And like, yes, that can be problematic in that it becomes about scoring points, but like everyone who does it, hopefully you're supposed to know that it's a gimmick, that it's just kind of a game that gets people excited about poetry. And the reason I bring that up is because that comment about how there's something about spoken word for me that like it's cool to see people saying things that matter, and it's cool to see people like telling their stories. But it's not just that. Like I often talk about like the youth that I work with here in the Twin Cities are not just great because they're young people telling the truth. They're great because they're legitimately good writers and they're legitimately good performers. And like if you go to a poetry slam, you're gonna see some of the best performance art. At least in my community. I know that not every poetry slam is great. I've been to a lot of really, really bad poetry slams, and I've been to a lot of really, really bad open mics. But I think that there's something about slam as a manifestation of democracy, saying that at a poetry slam, and this is true for open mics too, but I think especially at a poetry slam, like anyone can sign up, anyone can share, anyone can be a judge, anyone can decide for themselves what they like or don't like, anyone can like, you know, again, tell their story. And I think there's something really valuable about that, that just doesn't have a lot of mirrors and other aspects of society. Like it's a very special space. And so that comment about like these events are fun too. I mean, hopefully if they're good. Yeah, so I appreciate that. Cool. Are there any hands up, or should I just keep moving?
That is all we have for now. I'll keep you
Okay.
up to date.
Okay, I'm gonna show another screen quick as we move on from the super basic introduction to what spoken word is into this idea of like again how it then relates to this kind of work. And I start with this idea. I'm gonna show on my screen this picture that I drew using an online like app. You can see that, right? And so this is a story of two people. I learned this from a poet who also does really incredible work around masculinity and violence prevention, named Eric Mata. If any of y'all know Eric, he was at UW-Madison for a long time, and he went down to like Loyola in Chicago. I think he's living in Milwaukee now. But Eric, one of my mentors, one of my favorite people. But he taught me this thing that is about poetry, but I want to also talk about how it relates to advocacy work. And that this is a story of two people, right? So this is the earth and whatever. This first person every day walks along the beach with like a metal detector. And a metal detector can reach down, you know, a couple of feet into the ground. They'll go from point A all the way to point B and find some, you know, loose change and some cans and stuff like that. The other person here is an archaeologist, and their job is also to like dig in the ground looking for stuff, but they'll just go maybe from here to here and then dig down, because that's where you find the, you know, dinosaurs. The idea being that in poetry, right, the more ground that we try to cover, usually the less deep we can get with it. So when you try to talk about like big issues like war and family and love and generally the things that we want to write about as poets, when we just talk about them as big issues, we don't get very deep with it. So the idea is, you know, how do we, I'm sorry, I'm writing in this app. Zoom in. I'm used to writing on a whiteboard. I love whiteboards. But yeah, how do we zoom in, right? So how do you take something that's really big and zoom in on it until it's small? So rather than write about issues and ideas and concepts, you're writing about things like memories and moments and scenes and objects and faces. The idea being that like, you know, there's a ton of research out there around how people ingest information. And I'm particularly thinking about this in terms of like election year advertisement, stuff like that. Like what actually convinces people, right? You say all the statistics about climate change, or you show a sad video with sad music of a polar bear like dying, right? Like what's actually going to get people to care about stuff. And you know, this is, I think, really valuable in poetry, in that poetry for me is a translation process. It's how do we take abstract ideas, feelings, and values and translate them into concrete images, moments, and scenes. So again, if you remember your English class or whatever, your language class in high school, abstract language are ideas, you know, things like freedom, right? Like you know what that means, but you can't touch it. You can't take a bite out of it. Whereas concrete language is anything you can see, hear, taste, smell, or touch. And so how do you take, again, stop sharing. Okay, cool. How do you take the big issues and turn them into things. So like, again, to write about environmental justice versus to write about a lonely polar bear cub. That's an abstract issue versus a concrete image. To write about war versus to write about the first time you step into your brother's empty bedroom. Like, what does it look like? What does it smell like? How do you feel in that moment? To write about racism as a big abstract issue, or to stand up on a stage and like shout at people to say, hey everyone, racism is bad, don't be racist, it's bad. Versus writing about a specific moment or memory that you have in which the concept of racism like really meant something to you. So which is all to say, again, on a poetry level, in like a communication sense, audiences tend to get, I put that in quotes, like get concrete images, stories, scenes in a deeper way than just like, here's how I feel about this. Which is, for many people who write poems, the first instinct is to write a, here's how I feel about this poem. Like poems often start in your own head of like, why doesn't this person love me? Which is, valid. And I think for a lot of people, that's like at least the first step. Like sometimes you just have to write those poems that are just like, here's how I feel, or I don't know what to think. And that's okay. Like, whenever we're young people, I'm like, you write what you need to write. What we're talking about here is a tool. In that, like, this is a tactical approach to writing. And so one actual activity that I do with students, and this will relate to, again, what we're talking about in a minute, is about like zooming in. So you start with a topic, and then I just, on my page, I write like 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 going down in a column. Level 1 is just like your topic. So let's say you want to write about love. Love is the most abstract, big idea type topic you could come up with, right? When I say the word love, everyone sees different things in their heads. So step 2 is just that translation process. Like when you hear the word love, like what do you see? Not like what you think about or what you feel, but what do you actually like see in your own head? So people will say things like hearts, or people holding hands, or maybe it's a specific person's face, or flowers, right? And so let's say number 2 then is flower. You go from love to flower, from abstract to concrete. But flower is still like not very specific, right? So how do you zoom in even more? So then it's ask questions like, what kind of flower? And then it becomes, everyone always says rose. And I say like, what color rose? And everyone always says red. And how many roses? And everyone always says 12 red roses. So you go from love to flower to rose to 12 red roses. And then, you can zoom in even more. So like, where are they, right? Or what's going on around them? People will say things like 12 red roses in my locker, or 12 red roses on a park bench, and 12 red roses in the garbage can. And like that, then after you zoomed in to get to a very specific focused image, that could then maybe be the first line of the poem. So rather than starting the poem by talking about love, this big abstract issue, you start the poem by talking about a specific thing that you see, that you hear, that you smell, that you can like understand in concrete reality. And that becomes an entry point for the audience, and for the poet too, to be able to make sense of all the stuff going on in their heads. It can really, really help, even on a self level, to start with something concrete like that. Another example, just to run through it really quick, like going from fear, again, fear, big abstract issue or idea, right? Fear to bug, because you're scared of bugs. What kind of bug? A spider. What kind of spider? A tarantula. Where is the tarantula? A tarantula in your room, whatever. So like the first line of the poem, rather than sometimes I feel afraid, the first line can be, I wake up staring into the 8 beady eyes of the tarantula on my pillow. Which again, still allows you to talk about fear. Like maybe that's a metaphor for like some deeper idea of fear that's going on, but it starts there because that grabs the audience and brings them in. I think it can be counterintuitive for people who don't, have that like arts lens or whatever, but I think sometimes you get to push your ideas further by not coming at them head on. You get to stretch your message a little bit. Like you get to not just tell your story, but think critically about how you tell your story and about what you want people to like walk away from your story with. And I always tell students too, like it's a tool. You don't have to do any of this. Like I think that concrete language thing is really useful, but you can still write an incredibly powerful poem that's just you telling the audience how you feel. Like that's okay. But I think where this like tool, this concrete language tool really shines for me is when we start to talk about activism, and how, as much as this is useful for writing, I think activism is also about this process. Like how do you take something that's big and abstract, for many people, like misogyny or white supremacy or rape culture, and zoom in on it until it's something that is actionable. Because, when you talk to people, or at least when I talk, I won't tell you what you go through, but like when I talk to people, especially young people, I get the sense that young people are not like apathetic as much as they just don't know like how to start doing anything about this stuff. Like they care about these issues. It's just we don't in school get a good education about like organizing and about how change really happens in a society. Maybe we learn that like voting is important, and like voting is important, right? And maybe we learn that like you should be a good person as an individual, and like you should be a good person as an individual, but we don't necessarily learn about like the labor movement and like the civil rights movement beyond Martin Luther King Jr. We don't learn about we learn maybe we learn about the suffragettes, but we don't necessarily learn about like the you know you don't learn Kimberly Crenshaw intersectionality stuff in high school, right? And so I think part of why this exercise is useful is you can do that same zooming in exercise to talk about like how an individual might situate themselves as part of a movement. How do you draw power from the idea of specificity? It's about where to start. Because the other thing that I found working with a lot of young people, like high school students and college undergrads especially, is that this generation is super, super smart when it comes to like understanding the issues again of rape culture and consent and that kind of thing. I find more and more students like know all the words and know all the language and the jargon, but again, don't necessarily have an organizing background. So they know how to talk about it on social media and talk about it even with their friends, which is useful and powerful. But like if we're talking about how do we activate young people, how do we get them to identify as advocates and activists and join organizations and do the work, I think this is the same process, right? So you start with the big issue. So you start with a big global issue like rape culture. And if you were to zoom in on that until it becomes something small, something actionable, what might that be? And so like an activity we might do is for people in the room who are advocates or who do this work every day, what was your entry point into the work? It's not necessarily like what was the thing that made you care about it, but it's what was the thing that got you involved as an activist, as an advocate, as someone who does the work. And so like, again, on a poetry level, for me, that's something like sitting down at a laptop to Google the organizations in my city who are doing this work. Like that's a really, really small, actionable thing, right? But that's how you plug into stuff. Another one is like for students, if you're a college student, and you're looking at this idea of, again, if we use rape culture as the example, that's just this enormous, deeply embedded thing in our society that as an individual, you feel like you can't do anything about just because it's so big. Again, zoom in, zoom in. You send an email to your advisor to set a meeting to talk about like gender, women's sexuality classes you might be able to take at your school. But again, that doesn't solve the problem of rape culture, but it puts you on a path to maybe becoming an advocate or an activist that can help dismantle and disrupt that problem. Yet another example of what that zooming in process might look like is like maybe a young man sets up a dialogue circle, goes through the campus process of reserving the room and putting up posters and like doing a Facebook invite to get other men to come into the space to start talking about, healthy masculinity stuff. It's just, again, how do you take the big issue and turn it into an action? And this is a very shallow way of talking about it right here. When we have a group of students in the space, we can be super, super specific to be like, so what does specificity mean to you? What does action look like to you? What are different ways you can, again, do that zooming in process? Because it's funny, like if any of you like know me, then I will not presume that any of you know me. I'm not that famous or anything, but I think people, when they know me as someone who comes to a college to talk about the specific issues, to talk about consent and to talk about healthy masculinity or whatever. But I think that the actual work that I do is to talk about power and agency. And it might be, in one case through the lens of talking about consent and through the lens of talking about masculinity or through the lens of talking about white supremacy or, a whole host of other issues. But I'm really interested in talking about power. And I think when you go through this process of making a big issue smaller, you're also increasing the power that you have to do something about it. And so yeah, so that's like the basic kind of framework that's in the background of all the different work that I do. But I want to, for the bulk of our time together today, I wanted to talk about application. So like, how do you actually take that framework and use it in the work that you're doing, whether you are doing trainings for people or whether you're, an advocate or doing support work or whatever. I'm interested in what that looks like. So I have 4 examples. I don't know if we want to pause for another second to see if there are any hands up so far.
Not currently.
Okay, cool. And so in a second, I'm going to share another link. Let's see. So when we talk about application, I guess, like I said, I want to share 4 thoughts that I've had related to how this stuff actually plays out in this work. Because nothing I've said so far is probably stuff you don't already know on some level, right? Like the idea that like telling stories is more powerful than sharing statistics. Like I think that's something that more and more people are just getting, right? That an hour-long PowerPoint presentation is usually not as effective as something that involves narrative. The idea that specificity with regards to messaging is important. And so again, so what might this look like in practice? 2 of the examples that I've thought of are very spoken word specific, but I think 2 of them are also just broader. Because again, this isn't like, I don't care if any of you like spoken word or even end up using it in your programs. I think there's a deeper thing we're talking about here about how we approach work within art's lens to it. So the first one here is just to be spoken word specific, like using poems as dialogue builders in educational spaces. And I think of educational spaces as like trainings, like whether that's your volunteer advocates are being trained or whatever, like that could be a space. Maybe it's a social media thing, like every week you post something that goes out in the community, or maybe you're doing some other type of educational space. I think spoken word can be really good entry points into deeper, more authentic dialogue than we often have access to, right? So like my grad school research was about spoken word as a creative intervention that we can use to make social justice education spaces more critical and ultimately, I think, more effective. So again, if you're doing a first year orientation program, for instance, to talk about consent, showing a showing a good spoken word video, I think can do a lot of work because they're really short. They tend to be just 3 minutes long. It's a human being talking and often using narrative elements, telling a story. You can make the issue more real by putting a human face on it. It can be a specific entry point into a larger conversation. And also, it can allow that the young people themselves to be the focus of the conversation and to be the messenger. Because a lot of spoken word videos, ones I'm going to share, are young people or people who are more or less the age of the people you might be working with. Well, again, you all might do different work. Like I do a lot of first year orientation stuff. And so I'm thinking about that basic age range from like 16 to like 24 or whatever. So one example I would like to share just as a page, this is publicly accessible. Oh, can you already see it? It's already up, right? The beginner's guide.
We see the beginner's guide, yep.
Okay, cool. I'll delete this. Okay. So I wrote this. This was part of my research, right? I looked at the wealth of poems that are out there because there are thousands and thousands of spoken word poems like on YouTube that you can find, and a lot of them are not good. Like I'm fairly critical because I'm a poet myself, and like I come from that world, and so I think if you just Google spoken word poems, there's so much bad stuff that'll come up. So what I did was I tried to organize a list of 100 plus poems that one I think have something to offer in educational spaces, 2 have good kind of video audio quality, which I think is important, and then 3 are just generally like good poems. So every poem on this list will share at least 2 of those 3 factors, hopefully all 3. And I've tried to organize them by topic. So feminism, masculinity, and gender. Here are a dozen plus poems of different people holding different identities, approaching that idea from a different angle. You can show one of them, even if that one poem doesn't speak to every person in the room or not everyone can relate to it on a very specific way, it can be a dialogue starter. a bunch of poems on rape culture, consent, and healthy sexuality. And I mean, these first two categories are really what we're talking about. But then there's also, you know, if you're doing trainings for your staff about like anti-Blackness, white supremacy, you know, homophobia, transphobia, all that stuff on mental health, body image, and it goes on and on. I'm trying to keep adding to this list too. And then on the same page, which I'll share the link in the chat box. I'll just do that now before I forget. There's also like kind of sub lists in here. So like a little while ago, I made another list talking about connections between masculinity and violence. So people who are having these like quote unquote healthy masculinity discussions to talk about how much violence, and I mean violence in a broad sense, right? So like, yes, domestic violence, interpersonal violence, but also like mass shootings, also war. So like talking about violence in a broad sense and how so much of it relates back to how we think about gender. And these very essentialist notions of what it means to be a man or whatever. And so you're a bunch of like articles that deal with that, but then also a bunch of poems. And again, poems coming from people who hold different identities and who can approach that topic from different angles, which I think is an ongoing theme here. And so right away, like I think we can come back to any of those specific poems and stuff in a little while, but I wanted to share those lists right away. Because at least in my experience, I found that the poems can become, I don't know, maybe a little more accessible entry points to conversation than some of the bigger picture like statistical information or like here are our Title IX policies at our school. Like you can still have that stuff, but then the poem can be a little bit easier to maybe connect to because again, on a super, super basic level, it's a human being talking. And there's something about that I think audiences get something out of. So yeah, what I do sometimes is like, you know, review the poems, write up a couple discussion questions. It can be that simple. Even in my book, for all of my poems, there's a whole section in my book that shares both discussion questions for just like dialogue, but also writing prompts. If you want to use writing as an activity in these spaces, whether people share it out loud or not, and I think especially if they don't, it can be really useful just to process. And so I'll share really quick, like the second point I had about application, and then maybe we can stop again if there are people have thoughts or questions so far. Because again, these first 2 points are really spoken word specific, and the last 2 points are not. The second idea for application is actually to use open mics and poetry slams as spaces of, I guess, agency and community building with each other, right? So it's like we talk about spoken word creates space for our storytelling, which we know from all the cognitive research is important, right? To stretch and not just be like, there's this thing also in storytelling and in spoken word spaces too, where it can be potentially re-traumatizing. You know, if the only thing we can do is tell our stories over and over and over, like that isn't always healthy. Like some people need that, and some people don't. And so I think one, to be really careful about that. But I do think that open mics and poetry slams allow people to process their experiences and tell their stories and connect to each other. And it opens up possibilities for that outside of just the literal telling of your story over and over again. A poem can have a specific angle, right? It can do a different kind of work than just like, here's the thing that people should know about. I'm thinking of, so to make it concrete, right? To zoom in and be concrete. There's a poem by a poet named Sierra DeMulder called Paper Dolls. And yes, it's a poem about rape culture. It's a poem about sexual assault, but it has a specific thing that it's trying to say, and that it's a poem about how society treats survivors. The kind of the thesis statement of it is the idea that like society says that you can be like strong, made of iron, or you can crumble, but like there's nothing in between. And just how unhealthy that is, and how unhealthy even parts of society that are trying to be supportive sometimes aren't. And so like again, that's a really powerful way, I think, to have a specific angle on the issue. Yeah, and there's a million specific examples we can share, and maybe we can do that at the end. But the other thing I wrote here is that open mics, poetry slams, themed readings, etc., can be entry points for future advocates and activists, as well as outreach opportunities to the wider community. And again, depending on where you're at, like spoken word might not be a super popular thing, and that's perfectly fine. But I do think that its popularity is becoming more and more and more in many different places, not just in like big cities or whatever. And if anything, it can just be an excuse to get people in the room together in a way that's different than like a rally or a teach-in or whatever. I've seen different colleges and different kind of advocacy programs across the country use it in different ways. And there are pitfalls. It's very easy to organize a bad poetry slam. Poetry can be super triggering, and so like making sure that there are resources in the space for people who might, be triggered by something that someone's talking about. And then doing workshops, like writing workshops beforehand. I know some people who do this kind of work who focus on like writing poems about joy, because that's really hard, right? So like, how do you sit down and write a poem about joy? How do you write a poem about agency? And like just having spaces for people to connect to each other as writers and as people who are trying to tell their stories. And then having the open mic or the slam. And I'd probably recommend organizing open mics before you jump to a slam, because again, that's the competition thing. That can be really messy. But themed open mics, which, a lot of people already do. So, some colleges will have a Take Back the Night, which is already kind of based around telling stories, but then we'll also do kind of a more poetry focused open mic night, maybe the next day or that evening even, or something like that. And I think, yeah, these very poetry specific things don't work for everyone in every situation, but I think they can be powerful in context. And so I'm curious, if this were more of a back and forth, I would ask, like, have people done this? So if people have experience with this, do you think there'd be a draw where you are for spoken word specific programming, or would it just completely like go, I operate in the Midwest. And so I know that a lot, I operate all over the country, but a lot of the work that I do is in Wisconsin, Minnesota, Iowa, and the Dakotas. And I know that the idea of standing up in front of people and talking isn't always something that people are super into. But I do think that that's shifting too. So again, before I keep moving into the other kind of application thoughts, just wanted to see if there are any questions or whatever.
Definitely, if there are people out there that have done something like Kyle's been talking about, open mic night or even poetry slam, please feel free to share.
We got some typing, so we might be having some people chime in.
Yeah, and so while you're typing, I can say, like, again, I have two more examples of what the application of what I've been talking about today might look like. And these next two have nothing to do with spoken word. It's more, again, about how do you embody the spirit of an arts-based approach to the work? And how can you use the kind of lessons that, or the tactics that artists use, I think can apply very directly to advocacy work. And so I'm going to share some of those. And I have a few, discussion questions. I don't have that much more stuff. And so this can go in whatever direction if people have other thoughts or questions too. Yeah.
We did just have a question. How might you present the idea of zooming in to middle and high school students? What topics might be the most effective?
Yeah, and that's actually a lot of the work that I do. So like, it's a little bit split in that when I get brought to a college, it's usually explicitly to talk about some of these issues. But yet here in Minnesota, I work in high schools and middle schools. I'm part of a couple different artist rosters who place teaching artists in schools to work directly with classrooms of students. And in those situations, it's usually more explicitly to talk about poetry. And so we still talk about, gender and race and all these like deeper social justice issues, but it's through the lens of just talking about like poems. And so we do the same zooming in exercise. Can do a lot of work in a middle school or a high school classroom. And that, a lot of times the first step I'll take, first step after just the whole like introductions, icebreakers, like all the normal relationship stuff building you do. But to talk about the zooming in exercise, the first thing I ask students to do is, can we collectively as a group of human beings make a list of like issues and ideas and problems and like things that you could potentially write a poem about? And I like that question. And, you might do it on your own first in your notebook and then in small groups, like, however you do it, in terms of the protocol. A big list on the chalkboard or on the whiteboard of like 30, 40, 50 different topics is interesting to me because it allows the students in the space to show each other what they're thinking about and what they care about. And so a lot of times you get stuff like bullying and like cliques and like personal drama, family. But also, I mean, you get addiction and abuse. And again, more and more middle and high school students also, will be talking about things like rape culture and institutionalized white supremacy and like some of that kind of stuff too. But a big list of topics and ideas. Again, one, for students to show what they're thinking about. Two, I think to show that there's always something to write about, like writer's block. Like there's always, you can just look at the list and randomly pick something and like share your thoughts on it. And then three, it also allows us to 10 people could take the same topic of bullying and approach that topic from 10 different, wildly different angles and different perspectives. And that's also a part of this poetry, I think, as critical education work, is acknowledging and like validating people's perspectives and like lenses on things, even if we push back against them, to acknowledge that they're valid, like people's stories are valid. And so, yeah, that's often how that starts. Working with middle school and high school students, we make the big list. We do the zooming in process, and I might start that levels exercise with like things that aren't, super controversial. So like, love and school, which, can be controversial, but like topics that are more universal for whatever group I'm working with. And again, that depends on who those students are too. So like demographically, relationship wise, like it might be very different. But then, doing that a couple times, then you could jump into a discussion on like racism or, domestic abuse, that kind of thing, and see where people's kind of perspectives bring them in that conversation. But yeah, the approach, the one thing about these tools that I'm sharing is they don't really change that much depending on the audience. Like I work with middle school, high school, undergrads, and adults. And I use the same activities. Like some of the internal stuff might shift and, has to shift in different ways. But this basic idea of translating abstract to concrete, I think, is pretty universal. And no matter where we're at in our experience, I think a lot of us haven't had that conversation before. And so it can be very generative in those spaces. So I don't know if that gets rambling a little bit because I can't see people's faces, but yeah.
Thanks, Kyle.
Were there others, or should I keep moving?
That was it for now. Cool.
Okay. Yeah. We could do a more like traditional Q&A at the end too. But yeah, I'll go through these other kind of application examples that came up for me. So the third one is, I think, workshop and training activities that stem from the translation thing we were just talking about, that translation exercise, but that focus on activism and agency. Right. So a lot of the workshop things we do in poetry classes are very directly applicable to trainings and like social justice education spaces. And so two examples that come up for me right away are, so we talk about bystander intervention, right? If you're doing a bystander intervention workshop, there's the very kind of classic archetypal view of what bystander intervention is, which is you are at a party and you notice this guy hovering around this young woman, kind of he keeps refilling her drink and he tries to lead her up the stairs. And then what do? And so it becomes the 3D, different people have different programs and stuff, but like you disrupt the situation, you distract, you delegate to someone else, like you do something though, like you take action in that space. And so I'm interested in kind of like the zooming in and the zooming out of that situation. And so one thing that I've done is when we're talking about bystander intervention actions, make a big box on the board of like, what are things you can do in that moment when that thing is happening? And then, you can have the conversation about all the different ways you could potentially disrupt that situation. But then also making another box that's just as big that says, what are things you can do outside of that moment? How do you, maybe we're talking about zooming in, how do you zoom out? Like what does bystander intervention look like, not in the specific narrative moment of what's happening, but how do you create a world in which that doesn't happen in the first place? Because and a lot of this is based on poems too. Like, again, I'm not really showing you a lot of poems here because I think the video wasn't working, but there are poems that deal with this. Like you could perform a poem or like share a poem on video or read a poem out loud off paper or whatever. and then have this discussion based on that. And so the bystander intervention moment outside of the moment, or the bystander intervention actions outside of the moment, people come up with a very different list, right? It's stuff like a more kind of responsible, proactive social media practice. So like sharing these articles and like calling things out online as well. Could be increasing your own capacity as an individual by like reading more books and reading more articles so that when that moment happens, you feel more of your own power to do something about it. It could be the rehearsal stuff, because like, I mean, you all do this work, so I'm not telling you stuff, but like the idea of rehearsing those situations can make, when you're in the situation, more of a muscle memory thing and less of a like, oh my God, what do I do? I have to recall all this information. So like rehearsal could go in that box. But that idea of scope on an activist level has been really interesting. And so another example of that idea of, again, scope, I think is a good word here, is if our question is, how do you dismantle rape culture? Like, what does it take to dismantle rape culture? That's a very general kind of abstract question, I think, by itself. And so what I've done in different workshops and spaces is to slice it up into 3 different boxes or 3 different categories. One is, how do you dismantle rape culture as one individual person in your own body? And then 2 is, how do you dismantle it in the communities you have access to? So your friends, your peer group, your workplace, your place of worship, your family, etc. And then the 3rd one is, how do you dismantle rape culture at an institutional, like, systems level? Because I think in any group of 20, 30 people have different expertises, right? Or people have different access to information. There are some people who are really, really good at the systems question, but who haven't necessarily done a lot of like the self-reflective work. That's also really important. There are some people who are really, really good at the self-reflective work and like who've read all the books and are experts on the idea, but maybe haven't done the stuff in the middle column of like, knowing their neighbors' names or like, doing any sort of outreach. And like, again, in a collective space, we can talk about how this system works, how in order to create change, you need the individual, the interpersonal, and the institutional. You need people pushing on all 3 of those levers at the same time for culture change to really happen. But that as one individual, you can plug in different ways, right? Even outside of the context of this issue, the classic example is like, we need people who, volunteer at the homeless shelter, but we also need people whose job it is to design cities in such a way where people don't experience homelessness at the same rates they experience it now, right? We need people whose job it is to make shelters obsolete. And we need both. And one individual could plug into that in different ways. But these conversations about, I think, again, scope is the word I keep coming back to, but also organizing. Like, these are activist conversations. Because yes, we also, we need the what is bystander intervention module or activity, but then I also think having that deeper conversation about, one, how do you do this, but then how do you create a world, how do you cultivate a world in which this is the normal thing that everyone does? I think that's a different conversation. And I don't think it's more or less valuable. I just think it's also valuable. So that zooming in and zooming out thing has been really useful for those, really concrete conversations about organizing. Cool. And then if people are thinking about that, the fourth point I had here about application was, I guess, thinking more critically about how we frame events, programs, and campaigns. For those, again, I don't know who all is in this webinar, but for those of you who do programming and like events, this could be, your annual fundraiser breakfast that you do. It could be a educational workshop. It could be, whatever kind of event, an outreach event. But can they have stronger hooks? And so that hook word is really important for me, which also relates to doing stuff, but I think is super applicable to other spaces too. Well, and actually, so before I even get into that, I had a sub idea here, which was I don't know if pet peeve is the word, but like to bring in artists early to a program as opposed to just like emailing them being like, hey, can you read a poem of this thing that we've already organized? I think artists have a lot to offer on an organizational level, but that's just my PSA for the day. This point is actually about, so in my research that I did, I looked at why certain spoken word poems on the internet go viral. And and why others don't. So why does one poem have 10 million views and one poem have, 10,000 views, even though they're on the same channel and, maybe the same poet or, whatever. Like, why do certain poems become something that people just need to share? Why do certain poems really take off and like become phenomena or whatever? And so I won't go into like the mechanics of how I did the research or whatever, but in short, like the stuff that I found, it was 5 points. One was brevity. So like all the poems that I found that went viral that had, X number of views versus the larger sample size, were short. They were all between 3 and 4 minutes long. And not just short mechanically in terms of their time, but also they had a certain like punchiness to them, dynamic, punchy. Their titles were often something that grabbed people right away. So like just that very, very basic thing, which, isn't anything super new or revelatory. The second one was an acknowledgement of audience and like who the target audience is. So, for me, I'm not just writing a poem about rape culture. I'm writing a poem that acknowledges my own identities, and acknowledges who my audience is, and acknowledges what I would like that audience to walk away from the poem with. Which, again, for those of us who are artists, it's not always a thing we want to talk about. We want to just like express our magical feelings, and people will, magically change. And I don't mean to sound very dismissive of that. Like, I do think that there's something important about that too, that process. But for me, at least in my research, the poems that really took off seem to have something really specific to say, and specific to say to a specific group of people. So a poem about whiteness versus a poem that is directed at white people to think about their whiteness in a particular way, versus a poem about whiteness that is directed at people of color, which maybe becomes less about education and more about kind of like collective venting and like self-care. Like they're just different poems, right? And again, that's not necessarily anything that's super, super smart or revelatory. That's just a thing that I think is important. The third element here was narrative elements, storytelling elements, which we've already talked about. Like, we know that storytelling, putting a human face on an issue is really, really important. Actually, one just really, really quick example of that, just because, I'm in Minnesota right now. I'm from Wisconsin, but I've lived in Minnesota for the past 10 years. In 2012, Minnesota was the first state to defeat a referendum to ban same-sex marriage in the Constitution. Where 30 other states had passed those referenda, Minnesota was the first state to, I think, to push one back. And a huge part of that, I mean, there are various reasons for that, but I think a huge part of it was the campaign, the coalition that came together to convince people to vote no on that referendum, was incredibly intentional about storytelling. All the advertisements, all of the video or radio, TV, internet, print ads were all based around. It wasn't, here are the constitutional reasons you should vote no. Here are the economic reasons you should vote no. It was all about just people telling stories. And so again, I think more and more people who work in politics and social justice are becoming cognizant of that. But so these last two are things that really matter here, I think. The fourth one is representation. So out of the top X number of poems that I looked at that have gone viral, all of them except one, it was like 29 out of 30 were performed by people who would, again, just kind of phenotypically or whatever, look young-ish. So like between kind of older teenagers to like young adults. And I think what that points to is more relatability stuff than necessarily about like authority or whatever. But people are drawn to messengers of that they can relate to on some level. This played out in a really real way. I did a program at some college out on the East Coast a couple months ago. And the organizers were really worried that people wouldn't come out to see me, which is like, fine, whatever. But they're worried for a specific reason. It was that like 2 nights before they had a similar program on like gender violence prevention. But it was like a student written and student acted theater production. And because everyone who put it together and organized it were students, like they were able to bring all their friends, they were able to really like make a buzz about that organization, as well as just some random guy coming in to do a program, which, I do good work too. But I think what it points to is like, I love, student oriented programs, because they can do work that those of us who aren't students just can't do in the same way. Like representation really matters in that sense. And then the last point here, I'm talking a lot, but the last point here is the idea of a hook, which brings me back to the very first thing I was talking about in this point. How can events, programs, and campaigns have hooks? And what I mean by that is, in a poem, the hook to me is what makes your love poem different from my love poem? What makes your love poem different from the 8 trillion other love poems that have already been written? It's the concept, or like the organizing principle of the poem. And poems that have strong hooks tended to go viral in ways that poems that didn't. So like one of the most viral poems of all time, at least in terms of live performance video, is a poem by Neil Hilborn called OCD, which, you know, the poem is fine, like as in terms of how it's written and how it's structured, like it's well done. But the reason that it has like 15 million views or 100 million views or whatever the number is right now, I think is because it's a strong hook. It's a love poem from the perspective of someone dealing with obsessive compulsive disorder, right? You can also think about this as the elevator pitch. Like, can you describe what a piece of art is doing in like one sentence? Other, you know, for poem examples, I'm thinking like my own poem that has the most views online is called 10 Responses to the Phrase Man Up. And like, it isn't necessarily that it's my best poem, but it has a really strong hook. It's 10 responses to the phrase man up. 1, blah, blah, blah. 2, blah, blah, blah. Yeah. And so I think in the same way that poems have hooks, programs have hooks, events have hooks. I'm thinking of, so around the same time as the marriage amendment referendum, we did a series of shows throughout Minnesota called Hip Hop Against Homophobia. It was a number of artists who identified all along the LGBTQ spectrum, like touring the state, basically, doing all these shows just to bring people out. One, it was just like a good show, a good rap show. But then we'd have tablers from the different campaigns and stuff. And it was a way to bring people into a space to activate them and get them together in ways that just like rap show that happened to have people tabling went into. So the title of it is important. There's an event here in Minneapolis that's regular called the Clituation, which is all, you know, women identified artists performing together, because for so long women have been shut out of so many like big ticket, you know, First Avenue shows and stuff like that. There's a writing program in town called Black Lines Matter, which is specifically a writing program for Black artists and poets. Again, that's just a good title. Like you could have writing circle for African American individuals, and like it would be the same program, but like Black Lines Matter is a hook. Those are all events. I'm also thinking of like campaigns, right? So if any of y'all, you know, for Halloween, if any of y'all who work on college campuses, if any of you do, there's stuff like the poster campaign that's My Culture, Not a Costume. If people have seen that, I can start at Ohio State. It's you know, a student holding a picture of another student, and the student in the picture is like dressed up as the student's kind of, you know, traditional garb or whatever, in a way like for Halloween. So it's saying like, don't dress up like other people's cultures to make fun of them, or even not to make fun of them, just like for Halloween, like people's cultures are not other people's costumes. There was also a campaign called I Too Am Blank. So in higher ed, I think one was like I Too Am Harvard. Like students of color from Harvard talking about the microaggressions that they faced at that particular institution. You know, which is jumping off the line from the famous poem like I Too Am America, right? So just thinking, there's no magic key here, but I think taking the time to think more critically about how we promote things, how we title things. And then it's not just the surface level promotion and titling, it's also, I think, the substance of them, how we frame our events and our programs and our campaigns in ways that really like grab people and stick out from the rest. And that's something that, like, you know, I've been an organizer for as long as I've been an artist. And I think when I was first starting doing any type of activism and advocacy work, I wasn't thinking about this stuff. I was thinking about like, I'm right, so people should come and listen to me. Or not me, but like we as a group or whatever, we're right, and that should be enough. And so the more that I've done both, the more I've started to see kind of the synergy between, again, the tools that poets and artists use and the tools that activists don't always use, but can use, you know? And so I hope that can be useful. So I have a couple other things here, but this might be a good spot to see if people have any thoughts or questions or whatever.
Yep, definitely use the chat for your questions. I'll give you a few seconds.
Yeah.
Guante, I really liked what you said about artists having more to offer at an organizational level, and I was wondering if you could expand on that a little bit.
Thank you for asking the question. Yeah, I get a lot of emails, whether they're for myself or whether they're for like the youth that I work with, or like we're having a rally and it's tomorrow. Do you know any poets who can come and do a poem? And like on one level, like that isn't necessarily like a bad thing. Like I want artists to be more involved in organizing efforts, and I appreciate when people want to incorporate art into their different programs and events. The difference though is I think it's treated often as like the icing on the cake or as the spice on the thing that's already been cooked. That's not, I'm a poet. That wasn't a great metaphor, but I think artists when they're involved from jump, from like when if there's going to be a rally in town, rather than calling the artist the day before the rally, calling the artist right after you've decided to have the rally and bringing them into the organizing process. Because I think artists, and something, we can get super deep with this about like how artists have a particular way of looking at the world and blah blah blah. And I think that's true. But I also think there are really basic, concrete, mechanical things that artists tend to be good at, like promotion, like designing a flyer that isn't just like rally for justice in like a big font, but actually has some type of artistic design elements to it that can grab people's attention. I think, artists are often in positions where we have to think about, so my show is 3 hours long. How do I create an arc in that show with the different performers and stuff to make it interesting and engaging the whole time? Whereas we've all been to like rallies that are just like speaker, 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 speaker. Everyone kind of goes home or whatever. And so I think like artists have a particular tool, not every artist obviously, but I think in a general sense, artists have a tool set that can be really useful. And I think, for those of y'all who know the Voices of Men stuff in Appleton, right? Like I really appreciate being brought into that process for like, the planning retreats that happens in the summer or whatever, and not just at the event in the fall. Partly because I think I have something to offer on the organizing level, but then partly just for myself too. Like I like it's affirming to be included in that way. It teaches me things that I can then use in my other work too. So we're also talking about like community building and like authentically building community with the different people who occupy different positions in our neighborhoods and our communities, if that makes sense. Yeah.
Absolutely. Thanks for that.
Oh, someone said it would be nice to hear an example and ask for audience reactions to a piece to show how the narrative gets deep.
How the narrative gets what? Sorry.
Show how the narrative gets deep.
Okay. Yeah, I could do that. That might be a good thing to end on. I know we're approaching the end anyway, right?
About 15 minutes or so.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah, I could definitely share something and we could talk a little bit about, well, one, it's a little awkward, like if people have responses, like that's great. But I can also talk about like the responses that I get, and like where those discussions can go and that kind of thing. Yeah, were there any others or should I just jump into that?
Oh yeah, there's one more. So we live in a small communities and have an awareness month coming up. Are there better places to find material to use? We haven't thought about using this before, and I think it would be great to introduce this into our community to raise awareness to the younger groups in the community.
Yeah, that's a great question because I feel like, and again, I'm maybe just super critical too of because I come from a poetry community, but like I do think some people just jump right in to be like, we're gonna have a poetry slam without really thinking about what that means and like the support that's necessary. And so I love when people ask for resources. The flip side of that is there aren't a ton of really good resources out there. I think I'm sharing my email address just in the chat box. Like I would love to be a resource. Even, I'm not saying you gotta like fly me out and pay me, but I could like email you thoughts about things that have worked in the past, the resources on just how to organize this kind of thing, different promotional ideas and stuff. So like I can be a resource. There are, a couple books out there on just like the basics of spoken word programming, but like I don't know if I could recommend any of them at this point. On my own website, I'm just looking at something really quick. Yeah, I have a big list of resources related to spoken word on my own website, but they tend to be a little bit more for practitioners, or like for young people who are trying to do more of it. So like, here are different ways you can get involved, different resources, things to watch, things to read, things to look at. And then this is Twin Cities specific, but like different specific opportunities to show up. But that, yeah, I need to make another bullet point on this list, I think, for organizers. I think that would be really, I'm gonna make a note of that. But I think in the meantime, I would say that I'm totally open to sharing any resources or expertise I might have on a programming level. And I have seen, even in smaller communities here in Minnesota, spoken word stuff be really successful. Part of it might be just doing it and see what happens, because like you never know, and like, because spoken word has become such an internet thing over the past 5 years, you'd be surprised at how many people are really into it. And then I think poetry more generally, people are also still into in different ways. But then also, like, once you've done something maybe a couple of years in a row, it builds. Like, there's Northfield, Minnesota, which is not a big city, has an annual poetry slam where they get like dozens and dozens of young people, and like they fill up their auditorium, and it's this incredible thing. But I think that's just because they've done it now for 3-4 years in a row. So some of it is the repetition effect. But yeah.
Well, I have a quick question. What level of planning is, or what's different in the planning between calling something an open mic night and calling something poetry slam, or more specific?
I mean, the other thing is, like, 99% of the people like don't know the difference. So you could call something a poetry slam if you just like how it sounds better. I would, as someone who comes from this community, I would rather people didn't do that. But so like an open mic is basically, you need a space, maybe a microphone. I mean, microphone's usually good to have. And then like a sign-up list, and people show up, they sign up on the sign-up list. You might have a couple people there who are like plants or whatever, like just so you know that at least a couple of people are going to sign up, and it isn't completely nothing the whole time. So yeah, my recommendation for an open mic is to do direct outreach to people who might have poems to share. You could also have people, if they're not poets, share other people's poems that relate to the issue, just to fill up the space, because in some places there might not be a ton of people. There might be people who want to come and watch, but who don't feel ready yet to actually perform. So yeah, but on a basic level, open mic, all you need is a microphone and a sign-up sheet. Whereas for a slam, slams have a structure to them, where you need, I won't go into super detail. Basically, like, you need 5 judges. Judges need like score sheets or like whiteboards that they can write on, or something so they can show their scores. Or, you don't have to show the scores out loud. You can write them on Post-its and pass them down to a scorekeeper. Judges have to know what they're doing and like, kind of be trained for 5 minutes. Poets, like, you have maybe 12 poets sign up or 15 poets sign up. You have to have them all draw numbers to see who goes first. And then you write that down, you give that to the host. Like, it's a much more in-depth, kind of complex thing. And so again, if you're in a space where you think a poetry slam might be really successful, I'm not saying don't do it. I'm just saying that if it's like your first time doing a spoken word program, I'd start with an open mic, and then maybe once you have a good core of people who are into it, move on to a poetry slam. But all that being said, poetry slams are very doable. And that's another thing where I could, if you email me, I could share more of an outline of specifically how to run. There are also more online resources specifically for that. It's just a little more logistical work, a little more like materials that you need. But at the end of the day, like, both an open mic and a poetry slam, like, most of what happens is really similar. It's people going up to share their work. And slams, I think, do sometimes have more of a draw, just because it's the whole American capitalist like competition thing that happens. It becomes more exciting or whatever, and I think that has pros and cons. But yeah.
Oh, thanks. So,
Well, the
people
other thing
have
I should
more
say, just
questions?
in terms of events, like there are open mics, there are poetry slams, but actually what I've seen the most like success, and this is anecdotal, but I think has been kind of themed open mics. So like again, on a college campus, a lot of the work I do is on college campuses. So like if you have kind of the advocacy center or like, you know, the survivor support services organization on campus co-sponsor an event with the literary magazine or the radio station, or if there's a spoken word group or something like that. And it's both kind of different entities feeding into it. Like those have been really, really cool. Because then you're usually have more people who are interested in actually performing. You can do more promotional work, that kind of thing. So, you know, even outside of a college campus in a community, you know, utilizing whatever other organizations who might align a little bit can be a really useful thing. And I know like that's obvious, but I wanted to at least share that too. And that relates to Hook. So rather than just having like open mic for equity or something, like just pushing a little bit further. So real quick examples. We did an event here last year, a couple years ago, called #YesYesYes. It was kind of like an affirmative consent event, or you know, we had a couple of poets lined up to read. We had a little open mic of people, and then we had different like activities. So like, you know, the whiteboard thing where you write like, what does consent mean to you, and like take pictures and have it on Instagram, have that hashtag, that kind of thing. That was a really cool event. We did another one. I'm blanking on the title, which is bad because we're talking about how important titles and hooks are. But it was like an anti-catcalling event, which was also really cool. But it had, again, there was a specificity to that. It wasn't just about like, let's think more critically about gender in a big vague way, but like an event specifically about catcalling and how catcalling relates to these other ideas and issues. Like that was really cool. Cool. Should I end it with the poem then a little bit, or was there another thought?
No, that would be great.
Okay. I'm trying to think what I should do. I know we don't have a ton of time either. So yeah,
Sorry
I mean,
to spring it on you.
no. Because yeah, if I could just hook up the video, we could watch someone else's and then we could all talk about it. But I'll just read one of my own just because I have it in my head and in front of me. So yeah, I'll do this one because this is, I guess contextually, this is a poem I often open with, and even for multiple age groups, for high schoolers, for undergrads, for adults, even for middle schoolers, because I think this is a poem that gets to some deeper discussion, but to kind of reinforce everything we've talked about today, it's also, I think, an accessible entry point into that deeper discussion. And, you know, again, could be wrong in different situations. It might not work the same way, but in a general sense, it's a icebreaker, conversation starter. So yeah. Okay, so the weirdest thing about having your hand crushed, right, is that the pair of eyes across from yours never stop smiling. As knuckles are compressed, as the skin is all but torn off the top of your hand, he always has this grin on his face. Even as the vein bulges from his neck, he smiles until you grudgingly mumble, "That's quite a handshake," and he releases you. And see, as a young man, I was taught that one's masculinity is tied directly to one's handshake, right? That when meeting another man for the first time, no sin was more unforgivable than placing a fish in his hand, the dead husk of a greeting. Your grip must be firm, like the way you hold your briefcase when you walk to work, or the way you know, hold the handle while standing up on the bus. Fine. Some men, however, prefer a grip like a battle axe mid-swing, like ripping the head off an antelope by tugging on the antlers. Some men treat every handshake as the gladiator's death match, a test of strength, a test of will. And when I meet these men, as I like weirdly often do, their tectonic plate handshakes never fail to illuminate my myriad insecurities. Like frozen there with purple fingertips, I'm reminded of the fact that I cannot stand the taste of beer. That like cars, I don't know anything about cars. They confuse and frighten me. That when faced with a barbecue and a pair of tongs and to overcook the meat every time, these men attempt to squeeze the testosterone from my body. And like maybe I'm just insecure, but studying his smirk more closely. I wonder if maybe that would make two of us, because as he wrings the color from my fingers, I find myself wanting to ask him, do you ever feel trapped? Like in the mornings when you're watching TV or whatever, and downing that protein shake made from raw eggs and liquefied steak and Axe body spray, do you ever crush the glass between your fingers by accident? Do you ever get tired of that voice in the back of your head? You know, the one that sounds just like Dennis Leary, telling you to constantly, every day, reaffirm that you are a real man by catcalling women and eating enormous hamburgers and getting into physical altercations over trivial nonsense and, I don't know, squeezing things really, really hard. I find myself wanting to ask him, do you hold your wife's arm like this when you're angry with her? Is there a teddy bear somewhere in your history being ripped away from a pair of hands that just aren't strong enough? Do you remember the first time your father wouldn't let you hold his hand when you crossed the street? Do you remember the way he looked at you? Do you remember being handed your firstborn son and not knowing how to hold him? Do you remember squeezing his shoulders like this the first time he disappointed you? Do you remember what it was you were trying to hold on to? And I know that there's just so much space between us as men. Sometimes we feel compelled to cram as much physical contact as we can into every touch. I know we become so comfortable with crushing, so hypnotized by our own strength, we forget how incredible it can feel to let go. Cool. And so I know we're pretty much out of time, but I'll just say really briefly, like that poem is used. Again, I don't think the poem itself has value to it, but I think what it is whether people like the poem or not, whether people can relate to the poem or not, like doesn't necessarily matter. The poem is the thing that we can latch onto in order to have a conversation then. You know, in some groups that might be a conversation about, like, if I'm working with like a football team, like, what lessons did you learn when you were a kid aside from like a firm handshake? Like, what else do we learn about what it means to be a man? Like, that can be a conversation. In a mixed gender group, or in a group who like already gets that toxic masculinity stuff, we can have a conversation about like what other quote unquote little things are related to these large realities of harm and violence, things we don't always think critically about or think twice about. So then becomes a conversation about scope and that whole zooming in and zooming out conversation, which I think no matter where we are in our development is a really important conversation to have. How like these little things aren't just little things; they're connected. And so yeah, I find that piece to be really useful in that sense. And it's also like, you know, it starts out, it's kind of funny, or like it's not super serious, and then it becomes serious, or like lets people's guards down, and then it, you know, serves the substance there. And it's very narrative. It's very just me telling a story. Yeah, that's online too if people want to look at it.
Awesome. Thank you so much for sharing that. And yeah, as you said, we are kind of running out of time. I'm going to wait a couple seconds in case anyone, got some people coming in with thank yous, but in case anyone has any questions.
Yeah, I have I'm trying to share a lot of stuff, right? So I shared the stuff about big lists of poems. I shared the 10 things everyone should know about spoken word, and then I shared another link which is just like my own stuff if that's interesting to people. But yeah, I mean, they're all hosted at my website, which also has my like booking information and, you know, contact information and all that as well.
Great. And as you mentioned before, you mentioned that you could be a resource to them, not necessarily that they'd have to fly you out and pay you and stuff, but they could in theory do that, just throwing that out there.
Oh yeah, I mean, especially people who work in colleges. A lot of what I do is in colleges, but also conferences, community work, etc. And because, you know, I'm from Wisconsin and I'm actually pretty close, like super flexible. So whatever makes sense for people, feel free to be in touch.
Awesome. And oh, you already shared your email. Great. So yeah, on that note, I think we'll just wrap things up. Thank you so much, Kyle, for speaking with us today. It's been a really great conversation, and thank you everyone for attending.
We just displayed the next few webinars coming up, so check out wacasa.org to register for those.
Thank you, Peter.
And thank you, Kyle.
Yeah, thank you.